Muy buenos días a todos. Y gracias por asistir a esta plática sobre derechos humanos y fronteras, Human Rights and Borders, que precisamente obedece y se enmarca dentro de un interés muy importante por parte de nuestro director, el doctor Pedro Salazar Ugarte, precisamente de atender muchos de los problemas que se generan en las fronteras y sobre todo, aunque no en términos limitativos, pero sí las cuestiones que estamos nosotros enfrentando ahora con estos cambios políticos y la situación entre México y Estados Unidos. Pero se inscribe, como les digo, en términos generales, dentro de este interés que tiene el Instituto, y me atrevería a decir, espero no equivocarme, que es un interés de la UNAM en general en relación al asunto de la problemática fronteriza y dentro de ello el problema migratorio. Y en ese sentido, precisamente con este interés que tiene nuestro director, nuestro rector y la universidad en general, justamente al asumir el cargo el doctor Pedro Salazar, él ideó la idea, precisamente la concretó un proyecto que ya tenía tiempo aquí en el instituto de establecer un campus, me atrevería a decir, una estación, formalmente hablando en términos de la reglamentación de la UNAM, en la frontera norte de nuestro país. Entonces, precisamente el Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas de la UNAM hoy en día cuenta ya, se llevan a cabo actividades y demás, con una estación noroeste de investigación y docencia, precisamente en la ciudad de Tijuana, Baja California, que tiene como objetivo justamente atender esta problemática de las fronteras, esta dinámica fronteriza, como lo hemos denominado, estas dinámicas fronterizas, y aportar precisamente nuestro granito de arena como Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas y la perspectiva jurídica, las cuestiones de la problemática jurídica en relación a precisamente este fenómeno. Entonces, justamente es una estación noroeste de investigación y docencia del Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas de la UNAM, que les digo ya lleva a cabo actividades constantes en la ciudad de Tijuana, Baja California, y esto es ejemplo de que también aquí en el Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas en Ciudad Universitaria, y está integrada precisamente con un número importante, 7 doctorandos, todos justamente, bueno, 6 de ellos de la ciudad de Tijuana, uno de ellos originario de la ciudad de Oaxaca, del estado de Oaxaca, que llevan a cabo investigaciones importantes allá y que precisamente impulsan esta estación noroeste de investigación y docencia, que seguramente pronto se va a inaugurar formalmente para todos. Además, se van a llevar a cabo eventos importantes, congresos internacionales, uno en noviembre, si mal no recuerdo, el 15 al 17 de noviembre, esas son las fechas, 15 al 18 de noviembre allá en la ciudad de Tijuana, sobre estos problemas precisamente fronterizos. Y veo precisamente aquí, en este momento, a muchos de mis colegas que han colaborado justamente en esta estación noroeste de investigación y docencia. Muchos de ellos precisamente se dedican concretamente al problema de las fronteras y han llevado a cabo investigaciones importantes en relación a ello. Y entonces, en ese sentido, quiero agradecerles, ¿no?, a todos su participación tanto en este evento como en la formación poco a poco de esta estación noroeste de investigación y docencia del Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas de la UNAM. Y concretamente también me gustaría agradecer de manera importante a la maestra Julia Flores, que precisamente fue la que contactó al profesor el día de hoy, seamos Tuama, espero no pronunciarlo mal. How do you pronounce your last name? Otuama. Okay. Lo tenía que tener presente el profesor porque si no nunca hubiera atinado. Entonces, justamente agradecerle a Julia facilitar la comunicación con el profesor, que el día de hoy precisamente nos presenta esta charla, esta ponencia, este documento con argumentos muy interesantes sobre Human Rights and Borders, Derechos Humanos y Fronteras. Si me permiten, le damos pie a la ponencia del profesor Otuama y en ese sentido tenemos dos replicantes a los argumentos del profesor Otuama. En primer término, la doctora Elisa Ortega, investigadora del Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas, precisamente una de las colegas que les comentaba que se dedican a estos temas y que precisamente también ha colaborado de manera muy importante en toda la organización de la Estación Noroeste de Investigación y Docencia. Y el profesor doctor Manuel Becerra, investigador del Instituto, director del Anuario Mexicano de Derecho Internacional, una revista muy destacada, debo decirle, como colega, director de revista, ¿no? En mi caso de Filosofía del Derecho, pero el Anuario creo que es una de las revistas más importantes en nuestro país en relación a los temas jurídicos y concretamente el tema de derecho internacional. Pero sin más, leo, si no tienen inconveniente, una semblanza del profesor Otuama y en ese sentido después damos pie a su ponencia y después a las réplicas respectivas. El doctor Otuama es director del área de educación continua de la University College Cork, ¿no? Centro de formación para el aprendizaje permanente y una de las universidades más antiguas de Irlanda. En este cargo es responsable de la calidad académica de más de 100 programas de estudio ofertados a 3.000 estudiantes al año. Es titular de las cátedras de Ciencia Política en el Departamento de Gobierno. Aquí dicen gobernanza, bueno, gobernanza. Su investigación está centrada en la teoría crítica social y la perspectiva de abordaje inicial es en derechos humanos, respeto y el reconocimiento de la dignidad, ¿no? Estas áreas que maneja el profesor Otuama se desarrollan en las líneas de investigación interdisciplinarias y frecuentemente se ubican en diversas fuentes doctrinales. Concretamente, derechos humanos, respeto, reconocimiento y dignidad, ciudadanía y democracia y derechos, ciencia y tecnología. El doctor Otuama es colaborador en la UNESCO, es miembro directivo del comité del proyecto Ciudad del Aprendizaje. Asimismo, actualmente desarrolla la tercera conferencia de la UNESCO en la Universidad de Cork denominada Ciudades de Aprendizaje. También participa como director en el Festival de Aprendizaje por la Vida y en el Laboratorio Vecindarios en Aprendizaje y Cork dentro de la Ciudad del Aprendizaje. Fue coordinador del Centro de Investigación Social Europea y durante su encargo fue catalogado como el centro de investigación no gubernamental más importante en Irlanda. Tiene una amplia experiencia internacional como experto evaluador, ha colaborado por más de 20 años con la Comisión Europea en Irlanda y ha evaluado programas a nivel nacional en Polonia, Noruega, Chipre y Rumanía. Ha dirigido mesas de trabajo en Canadá, Alemania, Bélgica, Italia, Turquía, Noruega, Suecia, España, México, Ucrania, Nueva Zelanda, Estados Unidos, Suiza y Reino Unido. El doctor Otuama fue editor fundador de la revista irlandesa de política pública. Es de profesión periodista y contribuye semanalmente con una columna en el Irish Examiner y otros periódicos en línea. De manera externa continúa su contribución personal como voluntario comprometido con diversos comités y juntas de coordinación. Ha ocupado altos cargos a nivel de órgano de gobierno internacional. Pues yo creo que es un gusto tener al profesor Otuama precisamente para discutir estos temas que, reitero, le interesan mucho a este instituto y a nuestra Universidad Nacional y creo deben de interesar a toda la ciudadanía en general. Professor Otuama, well, thank you very much for being here today with us. It's a pleasure. And everything I said, I can just make a quick recap by saying that I was introducing our campus in Tijuana, Baja California, the one I mentioned before, and then the presentation, CV, your curriculum.
Okay.
So it's impressive, and we're very happy to have you here today. So, without further ado.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And as it happens, I was in Tijuana a few months ago myself, and I could see the border, and I could see the walls and fences there, and you know, it's an incredible sight to see this border, which goes in a straight line across the country, and to imagine that this is set up with one purpose in mind, to stop people moving north and not for people moving south. And I think this is the essential problem we have in the world today in terms of rights and how we look at them. Okay, so you can hear me better? Yeah, okay. Maybe I can stand over here. I'm sorry that I'm speaking in English and that I'm not speaking in Spanish. I'm trying to learn Spanish at the moment using a little app on my phone. And after a few weeks of work on this, I got an announcement from the app. It said, "Congratulations, you are now 1% fluent in Spanish. Do you want to put this on your LinkedIn page?" So I asked my children, you know, I said, "Do you think I should put this on my LinkedIn page?" And they said, "Oh, Dad, please don't." So I'm 1% fluent in Spanish, so it probably wouldn't be enough to do this presentation. So there is one thing, I suppose, that has animated my thinking for a long time. And this is around the idea of human rights and where they come from and why they're important. And in relation to the idea of borders and the movement of people and so on, this is really, really important. And for today's talk, I had an idea of pursuing 5 different topics. And really, I think we can skip through some of these rather quickly because of the background of the audience here. I will be telling you things that you already know, and you don't need to hear it from me again. But I'd like to talk about some things maybe that I'm more familiar with and that might be of interest to you. So let's see how this works. Is it? Oh, I'm doing it the wrong way around, am I? Okay, all right, okay. These were the 5 topics I wanted to talk about. The other one is just coming down the end. So what's interesting is, I suppose, that there's a lot of literature, a lot of laws, conventions, and so on and so forth about legally framed formal rights that tell us what our rights are. But I think that's only one tiny part of the story. And we can often get drawn into that aspect of it. But I think the other 4 are probably where the problems arise, not at the top level. So just do a very quick run through civil legal rights, which are part of formal rights. And these emerged in the 18th century. And they're about autonomy and equality before the law. And of course, you all know this. And it's about the capacity of people to be able to make contracts and to have legal standing and so on and so forth. But it's interesting that we assume, I suppose, that these rights and the laws and so on that accompany them are all free from bias and free from moral values and so on and so forth. But of course, that isn't the case, and this is part of the problem. The next part of these are political rights, and these are really, really important. And I received 2 papers from 2 academics here in email recently, and I was reading both of them, and one of them actually talks a little bit, quite a lot about this idea of political rights in Mexico, and asks a lot of very, very, very interesting questions. The issue here, I suppose, is that the idea of political rights is that citizens have the right to make the laws that govern themselves. And if you think about the nation state and our original notion of the nation state as a place where somehow people are homogenous, they're all the same, they all belong to a single nation, and they all live in a bounded community. There's a border, everybody lives inside it, everybody has the same identity. Now, of course, that was never true anyway, but of course it's completely false today. That doesn't exist in the current world. And even when the nations were being created, you think about Mexico as a nation, with everybody having the same identity, the same values and so on and so forth, is a nonsense. Of course, it couldn't have been the case ever, but you try to make it a case like that. But one of the key problems that we face today is the idea that the people who live in a nation state make the laws for the nation state, and those laws apply to them. But of course, we know that a lot of law is now outside of the nation state. It's crossing borders at all kinds of levels. And this is a problem because some people in the world today, and there's a country, I suppose, just to the north of here, who has a president who believes that this country should be cut off from the rest of the world now. It should make its own laws, it should do its own things, and the rest of the world should just step in line. But he's not alone, of course. This is a big, big, big problem in the contemporary world. We see the same in Europe, where countries in Europe are saying, oh, you know, we don't want interference from outside. And one of the most traditionally progressive countries in Europe, the United Kingdom, which is our big neighbour. I'm from Ireland, and the United Kingdom is our United States. It's our big neighbour. And they voted for what's called Brexit. You may not have heard much about Brexit here, but it's really about trying to create a concept of a close community where they can escape from migration, where they can make their own laws, they can make their own trade agreements, they can do all of these things separate to the rest of Europe. Now, as a concept, you can sell this to people to vote, and they can vote for it, but is it real? Can you actually do that? Can Donald Trump really do that? That's the question. And I think, to me, it seems in the contemporary world, that's nonsensical. But part of the problem here is how the rights and constitutions were established for state. The idea of nation states, that they are autonomous, independent, and the people in those states make their own rules. And they are part of the problem that we have today in relation to borders. Okay. So I'm not sure what's in the top here. Oh yes, legally enforceable rights, factual rights. Okay, so factual rights. What I want to talk about here is the idea that there's a break between what is often your formal rights and what actually happens to you as an individual in the world. And one of the papers that I received spoke a lot about the idea that migrants as minorities would have all the rights of the country they live in as citizens. But in fact, this isn't the case. We know that's not the case. And I think what Brunkhorst says there is interesting because he says it's about being strong enough to enforce those rights. Or, so you can formally have rights, but how do you get them enforced? How do you make those rights mean something for you in real terms? And this is the issue around factual rights. So at what level do you, as an autonomous citizen or as a migrant, have the right to have your rights recognized. How can you make that happen? And that's a difficulty. Hannah Arendt, who I mentioned in the paper, you're glad I mentioned at least something that I have in my paper. I can see you're relieved there now. And Hannah Arendt is a very interesting philosopher. She was a German Jew, and she was writing about the context of homeless people, people without nation states, without countries in Europe after the Second World War. And she talked here about their freedom of opinion is a fool's freedom, for nothing they think matters anyhow. You know, it's an interesting thing to say, okay, you can have all the rights you can imagine, but if nobody's listening to you, if what you say doesn't count for anything, if you have no way of getting those rights recognized, and if somebody breaches your rights, you can do nothing about it. You can say, oh, well, I have a right to. It's basically saying it's a fool's freedom, because it actually means nothing. And this really is a huge challenge for us. With all the millions and millions and millions of people that are moving around the globe today, and exactly what their rights are is a big, 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 big question. And I'm living in Europe, and we see every day huge problems of people in the Mediterranean. People heading from Africa trying to get to Europe in really, really awful boats and drowning. I think they estimate that something like 2,500 people have drowned this year in the Mediterranean. Very recently, I was listening to a news bulletin in Ireland, and the Irish naval boats are there to rescue people. And they described, on that particular day, they had picked up, I think 500 people. And this is just one boat, one Irish boat. And the two of the people they picked up were a mother and her baby daughter, and they were both unconscious, and they just happened to be lucky in the sense that they were near this Irish ship and they were rescued. But this is a fairly typical example of what's happening in the world. And you say, so all of these people have rights. Of course they have rights. What good is your right if you're drowning in the Mediterranean? What does it mean? Then there's the question, even if you're in a country and even if you are a citizen and you want to go to the courts, I'm not sure what it's like in Mexico, but in my country, it's prohibitive. It's impossible. Ordinary people can't afford to go to court because it's too expensive. That's a problem. That's a big problem, but we don't hear much about it ever as being a problem. Once in a while, a pro bono case is taken for somebody, but the vast majority of people are excluded really from using the court system because they can't afford it. They just have to live with the reality they're in. Then there are issues around rights of situations in domestic contexts. Now, in the most extreme cases, maybe where there's violence or things like this, the police or whatever can step in and solve problems. But we know that there are lots of other kinds of issues and problems in domestic contexts where people's rights are denied them on a systematic way, but it's not at a level that they can actually do anything about it. So they just have to live with this reality. So they have rights, they have the same rights as everybody else, but actually their lived conditions aren't anything like what they should be. Then we have people's rights are chipped away at work, at school, etc., where their terms and conditions are very difficult for them, or they are subject to bullying or other things like this. So all of these people, at some level, have formal rights, but at a practical level, these may not have a huge meaning for them. So, the factual rights, I would say, the things, the critical things important, are being able to actually have your rights recognized and implemented. This This is a critical starting point. Having a share in the economic goods in society. And in the paper that I was reading, this is a big problem in Mexico, but it's not just a problem in Mexico. This is a problem right throughout the world. Because what we have seen, especially since the 1970s and 80s, is that there has been a huge concentration of wealth in a tiny minority of elite people in the world. And it was interesting, I'm not sure if it's still the case or not, but in that paper they said that the wealthiest person in the world lives in Mexico. Not anymore. But he's not living on the street, no? No. Oh yeah, okay. But so somebody has passed him out. He's only number second or third. Oh, he's only fifth. Oh, well. Look, it must be very hard on him. I don't know how many billions he has now, but yeah. So this is a problem. This is a huge problem. And we don't see it as a problem anymore. We almost can't articulate it as a problem because our neoliberal way of thinking has become so ingrained in our perceptions of the world that we have stopped being able to identify this as a real problem. And I'm going to come to something in a little while where I want to talk about that, because I think that actually fundamentally undermines the whole concept of rights. Now, there's huge problems around what we call the precariat. This is people who, even in the wealthiest countries in the world, are constantly living in a precarious scenario because of the types of contracts of employment they have, and so on. In my university, I'm living in the European Union, one of the wealthiest places in the planet. In my university, the cleaning used to be done by staff employed by the university. That's not done by staff of the university anymore. It's now done on, they say there are no zero-hour contracts in Ireland, but in fact there are. So these are done, the cleaning is done by people who are totally exploited, the gardening and all the other ancillary services. And this is a huge problem in terms of people's experiences. And if this is happening in the most developed, prosperous parts of the world, what does it mean for people in the developing world? And of course, these are old issues around being seen as equal in terms of race, religion, gender, ethnic group, and so on and so forth. And even in the more developed countries, the wealthier countries, this is a problem. And it's especially a problem at the moment for people who are Muslims, because they are seen very often as criminals and terrorists. I'm Irish, and I can tell you that in the 1970s and the 1980s, anytime I went to the UK, I was a terrorist. The very minute I appeared at an airport in the UK, I was a terrorist. This is the automatic assumption. I was questioned, and not just me, every Irish person. We were questioned where we were going, why we were going, what we were doing, who our connections are, who our friends are, everything. Now, of course, there were Irish terrorists, but not everybody in Ireland was a terrorist. So this is a problem. And the other issues, which was around cultural capital. What I mean by cultural capital is the capacity to participate in society as an equal, to be able to speak the language, being able to converse with people and do things in that society on equal terms. And a lot of people are excluded from participation in their society as people on the same standing as everybody else. Now, I don't want to labour on this a little, but I want to go into a little bit more detail. This is the idea of how do we justify rights, because I think this is one of the critical problems that we have today, and this is one of the reasons why rights are all over the place. Because we say, Arendt used this word, a right to have rights, which is a really good way of saying it. So it's not just saying you have a right, but you have a right to have rights. On what basis can we say that? And how do we decide what rights are? You look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you look at national constitutions, and so on and so forth, and they are almost all based on Christian values, ultimately. They are ideas that arose from Western philosophical thinking based on ideas of God which are formed in a Christian context. Why should somebody in the rest of the world believe that this is the case? That these rights are justifiable on the basis of philosophical thinking that's really ultimately based on Judeo-Christian traditions. So I want to ask you to think about it in a slightly different way. I want you to sort of ask the question, where would rights come from to begin with? I want you to, for a moment, think of a scenario about yourself, a personal scenario from your own life. And think about some moment in your life when you were disrespected. It could be here, in the university. It could be on the street. It could be in your family. It could be someplace. But for sure, every single person has been disrespected at some time in their life. When you are disrespected, sometimes you're not exactly sure what's wrong with the interaction. You can't always be able to put your finger on the precise reason why you are disrespected, but you inherently realize that you have been disrespected. You think about that, and you say to yourself, there is something wrong in this relationship. There is something wrong here in how I am being treated. And if you think about that, you say, well, isn't this the actual seed from which human rights grow? Because what you are saying when you feel disrespected is you're saying, I deserve to be treated in a different way. Why do I deserve to be treated in a different way? Because I am a human being. The person who's disrespecting me is a human being. They are no better, they are no worse, they are my equal. And to me, that's a better place to start than to say, God says, because we have different views of God. And this is what Hannah Arendt is talking about, the idea of the right to have rights. So I see this in terms of what I call a symbiotic triad of recognition, which is about respect, about dignity and recognition. And when we move around in the world, we see people whose whole entire lives they're totally and absolutely systematically disrespected right throughout their lives. They never reach a place where they are respected, ever. But for all of us, at some point, we are disrespected. For me, I can tell you, going through the airports in the UK in the 70s and 80s, I felt disrespected. I am sure a lot of you have had the same situations, maybe when you arrive in the United States or something. So maybe I won't go into too much detail on this, but because it's a bit complex. But the idea here is that every single person has the right to be respected, to be recognized. To be recognized means that another person sees you as a human being of equal value to them. And if you're not recognized, then you cannot function in society. You could not be a human being unless you're recognized. Because if you think about how did you learn to speak? How did you learn to interact with other people? You did it because other people interacted with you. Other people recognized you. Other people saw you as a human being, and then you learned how to interact and so on and so forth. So these are really absolutely critical building blocks for society. I'm probably moving on a bit on time, am I?
You have 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. All right. So I'll go through these kind of quickly because I wanted to talk a little bit more about order, so maybe I'll move on to that. So I have already spoken a little bit about everyday experiences, so I won't labour that point. But it is what the one thing I would ask you to leave the room today with is to say, when I go out of this room, I am going to see in the world, I'm going to try and observe people being disrespected and see that as wrong. And if you can do that, the world will change for certain. I've spoken a little bit about this, so I'll move on from this as well a little bit. Now, this is a quote from Axel Honneth, who has written a lot about respect and recognition. And basically he says, it serves to designate the mutual respect for both the particularity and equality of all other persons. The particularity is important because we are not all the same. Everybody is different. So there's a particularity. Everyone has something unique and different about us. We come from different cultures and backgrounds and so on and so forth. So it's saying we recognize those, but we also recognize that every single person is part of the human family. Now, I just want to look at this little quote just for a moment, because there's something in this, I think, which is really, really important. And it's something that is really the big political issue for us. And this is the reciprocal vulnerability. When I say about reciprocal vulnerability, if you watch TV and so on and so forth, and you look at advertisements, it doesn't matter what country you go to. People are trying to sell you security. They're selling you health insurance. They're selling you all kinds of things that are going to make your life perfect. The one thing is absolutely certain. Your life is never going to be perfect. We can be absolutely sure of that 100%. You're never, ever, ever going to be in a scenario where your health is absolutely secure from all threat. You're never going to be in a position where your financial scenario, your personal life, your home, all of these things are going to be perfect. So we are all vulnerable. But there's a reciprocity in that, in recognizing that we are all vulnerable. And that is at a personal level with each other, but it's also at a global level. We are facing the greatest challenges imaginable in terms of climate change, and it's not just the weather, as some people think it is. It's about climate change, it's about the movement of people across the planet, it's about a whole series of hugely important things. And this is what recognition and respect and dignity are ultimately about, that mutual reciprocity, that we just have to recognize that we are all collectively vulnerable. Individually and collectively, everybody is. So this is why I think the idea of respect and dignity and recognition are the ultimate places to start in terms of human rights, not in laws and conventions, because those are important. Of course they're important. But we know that 99% of the actual experience of people's rights are not connected up with the conventions and the laws and so on and so forth. They are places of last resort. They are when everything else fails, then you go there. But there is an onus on all of us as human beings to reciprocate with each other. Now, this is one from one of the papers that I was sent from one of your colleagues here. And I thought this was really interesting because it said in the paper that he was talking about young people in Mexico. He said most of these young adults are victims of the inequality and exclusion characteristic of Mexican society. So he's saying here we have a huge population. I think it's a third of the population or a quarter of the population are young people, and their opportunities are systematically cut off from them. And it goes on to say, those who have no path into civilized society will likely look for recognition, acceptance, and economic resources elsewhere. So, if we set up a society in such a way that we exclude people systematically, then we can expect problems. We can expect very, very, very big problems. And this is where we are in the world today. Now, in terms of the borders, this idea of hospitality, this conditional and unconditional hospitality, this idea of, you know, what do we do in terms of the stranger? And, you know, we don't think about this, but we are all ultimately are strangers. Everybody's a stranger anyway. So what happens when the stranger comes to your country? You're telling me 5 minutes? Okay, I'm going to move on here a little bit. So I think this is a critical problem in terms of the idea of strangers and the idea of creating the idea of strangers, saying that there are others, is problematic. And the idea of saying that nation states can build borders, make laws for themselves, and exclude other people, that's problematic. We may not think of it as problematic if you're inside in this border and you're behind these safe walls, or the concept that we think we are in these safe walls, but we are. It is a problem. And again, this is from one of your colleagues here. Céline Benabi talks about this sovereignty territorialism. And this is the idea that judges are seeing the world in a way where they say, okay, these foreign laws don't apply to us. We make our own laws here. And we're only interested in the laws of our nation state. The world has changed. That's no longer the world. And you can go right back to the Middle Ages. You can go back to Hugo Grotius, who was writing 300 years ago, and he was talking about the sea. Who owns the sea? Now, thankfully, we came up with the idea that everybody can use the sea. Could you imagine if we started putting borders in the sea? What kind of a world we'd be in? But we think it's okay to do it on land. And this is the big debate we have today. And at the moment, the nationalists, these ultra-nationalists, are in some places winning the day. And they say, we have no obligations to defend our national territory, so we put up a wall and we get our neighbours to pay for it. We defend our culture, we defend our values, we defend our religion, our jobs, and we make our own laws. So this idea that you can somehow stay safe within your own little border and that the rest of the world can do what it can do. We know that's not exactly going to work. And we have, at the other side, we have a whole host of international law and norms, conventions and declarations and so on and so forth. And, you know, they recognize the rights of all around the planet, well, in most places anyway in the planet. And I just wanted to, and maybe we can finish with this because I realize I'm running out of time. There were a few other things I wanted to talk about, but it's probably pushing the boat a little bit. Karl Otto Appel spoke about global ethics. And this is an alternative way of trying to see the world from the idea of, you know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, national constitutions, and so on and so forth, and say, well, you know, there must be another way of seeing the world. So I'm sorry that you'll have to look up on one of these side screens here. So here's four key ideas. One is that it's anti-foundational ethics. Anti-foundational ethics is saying that instead of trying to get to a place where we say these are fundamental rights, instead of saying there are fundamental rights, and of course there are certain fundamental rights, but instead of saying, yeah, everything is about fundamental rights, you're saying there are certain starting points. There are certain starting points. So to kill another human being is wrong. But that doesn't mean all the other rules and regulations are necessarily right or wrong. We have to start and we have to, at some level, debate and discuss them and say, well, we need to figure out why they're right or otherwise. sorry, I have to go over here now. They're free from national or context-specific constraints, in particular. So we can't have a world where we say that Mexican values apply everywhere on planet Earth. We can't have a world where we say Christianity is the basic rule. So we have to have some kind of a scenario where people across the globe can say we can buy into some ethical standards that can apply everywhere, and we can debate and discuss them. So it's not tied to specific cultural worldviews, and this has been part of the problem. European values, European Christian values have been exported across the world and said these are the ultimate values. And it's procedural rather than substantive. So what do I mean by procedural? It means that it's about discussion, it's about debate, it's about people having the right to say what they think, and rather than being top-down or fixed and set forever. And this is, I suppose, an alternative view to the kind of nationalistic view. It's sort of saying, okay, we can have a debate across the globe where everybody, regardless of how rich or poor they are, can have something to say. And I think we are in a very strange place. Maybe we are at a border now, at a border crossing, where neoliberal values have become really dominant, and they are about securing the welfare of a tiny minority of extremely wealthy people in the world. And then the question is, what about everybody else? What about the billions and billions and billions of other people on the planet? Do they count for anything? And it was interesting in one of the papers that you sent me, they were talking about economic development in Mexico under kind of the neoliberal regime. And it's not just Mexico, it's everywhere. The growth that this was supposed to produce, in fact, doesn't exist. Disparities in wealth continue. And it's the same in Ireland. We're in a very wealthy country, really. But the actual real living standards of people is dropping. People can't afford to buy houses. Young couples starting in the world now, they can't afford to buy houses. They can't set up their families in the same way as people of my generation could do. And my generation could do it less than the generation before them. So there's a problem here. We need to start waking up to the problem, because there are certain problems in the world that we can never solve at a national level. We're going to have to collaborate and cooperate, and we're going to have to look at things at a planetary level. So I suppose these are. I'll stop there because I could stay talking for a bit longer, but it's probably a bit of a challenge.
Thank you very much. Pues yo creo que inmediatamente continuamos con la réplica.
Okay.
15 minutos.
15, vale.
Porque yo creo que...
Para dar espacio
exacto, para las preguntas.
Por supuesto.
Y yo también quiero entrar al debate, así que...
Me pongo mi reloj.
15 minutos y 15 minutos. Elisa, adelante. ¿No?
Bueno, pues buenas tardes a todos y a todas por estar aquí. Hello, Professor Seamus Otuama, for being here and your compelling exposition, which has many relevant points to discuss from my point of view and my research area, which is law and migration. My exposition will go from the general to the particular, and will start saying that I would like to note that your paper gives theory a fundamental place in the building of your arguments, and this could be seen as obvious for most scholars. But it isn't in migration studies, where the trend, from my point of view, is to privilege numbers and statistics and almost omit theory, to understand and analyze complex phenomena such as the one you discuss in your paper. In a few words, migration. So I found your paper very compelling in this particular issue, and I applaud your fantastic use of theory and connect scholars from different traditions and times, from Thomas Hobbes to Seila Ben Habib, passing through Hannah Arendt, of course, just to give our audience an example. Having said this, I'm going to point out a few things. Your paper addresses differences between formal and factual equality in close relation to the international framework of human rights and how this has an undesired consequence, that is the denial of rights within states for a variety of reasons, including race, nationality, migration status, I will add, ethnicity, among others. So, from my point of view, it's fundamental to note how it would appear that after World War II, the international community has made substantial progress in terms of recognition of human rights to everyone. But reality shows that millions of people are abandoned in terms of having their rights afforded, such as migrants, refugees, and stateless persons. And within these persons, vulnerable groups such as children, women, LGBT, handicap, etc. So I believe that it's brilliant that you stress the urgency to come back to the basics, to the fundamentals, as Arendt put it on 1973, that everyone, for being human and not for God or natural law reasons, has a right to have rights, as you said in your expositions. And in this point, I come back to my initial statement of the great value that the scholars use theory in their research. We need theory to analyze, as Arendt put it, on what basis can we claim rights and owe solidarity to our fellow humans, especially those most disadvantaged as migrants, refugees, stateless persons. For instance, Arendt responds to this saying that if we share the human condition, then we have an innate right to human rights and we should procure them to everyone. As she says, the right to have rights, or the right of every individual to belong to humanity, should be guaranteed by humanity itself. I believe this is very important. So at this point of the development of the international human rights law, we could say that the instruments for recognizing, defending, and enforcing these rights are essential for a decent human rights regime, all these covenants and instruments of human rights. But this can only be reached if we can defend human rights in all and every circumstances for every human being. And here we find again people at the margins of society, such as migrants and refugees, who most of the times live in what some scholars have called spaces of non-existence. So, as you said, despite the fact that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states in its Article 1 and its preamble that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, it is clear that neither the spirit nor the letter or the declaration have been taken very seriously by many states members of the UN, who are destiny countries for migrants and refugees, let's say, for example, the US, as you say in your exposition. So, while rights can be declared universal, they are interpreted and implemented in legal contexts defined by political boundaries and agreements. This means that the right to have rights, as Arendt put it, is not universally interpreted, leaving us with a world where the most fundamental rights are arbitrarily denied, even for children. For example, states run a dispositive to control undesired immigration, irregular migration who can be forced, by implementing two policies that end up denying rights for migrants and refugees. These policies are detention and expulsion. And this is applied most of the times regardless the age or particular condition of these people, because the letter of the law can state one thing, but the practice is completely different. For example, here in Mexico, we have the practice to detain and expulse migrant children who come from the North Triangle of Central America, despite the domestic and international regulations which expressly prohibit it. And here we can see how migrant children move between two contradictory normative frameworks: a protective one, which is given by international law, and a restrictive one, which is given by domestic law and policies which control immigration. As you can see, these children are first migrant, irregular in many cases, and then children and, in a few words, human beings. So the point of your paper is not trivial at all, because even in democratic and constitutional states where rights are respected for citizens, the same protections often are not extended to migrants and refugees. This is justified through the creation of boundaries that mark off territory and redefine rights not as universal, but specific for outsiders. And you have all the reason when you say that it's contradictory to pronounce human rights as universal, while simultaneously delimiting rights to others on the basis of the place of birth, economic disadvantage, or gender, or age, I would add. And here, if we go on with theory, we find the state of exception scholars, such as Agamben, and previously, of course, Foucault, who Agamben used as one of his main inspirations. And we find the importance to analyze this state of exception with the actual members of the United Nations have created for outsiders, the others. But actually, this can be traced back to the signing of the Westphalia Peace in 1648, when the modern state-nation was configured. This state of exception, which limits rights for these others and, of course, is contradictory to the spirit of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its Article 1. And with this, I finish my participation, and thank you again, Professor Seamus Otuama, for your vibrant and compelling paper.
Récord, Elisa, récord en tiempo. Esperemos que también el profesor Becerra.
Bueno, a mí me dijeron que mi participación iba a ser en español, en principio. ¿Sí?
Lo que usted quiera.
Bueno, vamos a... Sí, porque pretendía yo hacerle inmediatamente una respuesta en inglés, pero temo...
Yo creo que...
¿Sí? Sí. Bueno, yo tengo varias observaciones. En principio, lo menciona el profesor, la evolución del derecho internacional. Me parece que es bastante interesante porque son puntos que en derecho internacional tal parece que no salimos. La discusión en 1948 sobre la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos, prácticamente el mundo se dividió entre los derechos sociales y los derechos políticos. Y era entendible, el mundo estaba dividido entre dos polos. Voy a tratar después de hacer un resumen para el profesor. Era entendible la división de polos entre el polo socialista y el polo capitalista, y eso da pie a que definitivamente la Declaración Universal, que lo toma mucho el profesor como punto de partida, sea meramente una declaración y no un tratado internacional. Posteriormente, como lo sabemos, y él lo menciona también, vienen los tratados internacionales de 1966, en donde de alguna manera se positiva el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos. Pero es interesante, después de la Guerra Fría, cómo la situación persiste. Por una parte, derechos de carácter civil, en donde tienen una gran relación con el sistema de carácter liberal, y por otra parte los derechos de carácter social, el derecho a la salud, el derecho a la vivienda, etcétera, etcétera, derechos económicos. Y tal parece que volvemos a lo mismo, hay un retroceso, no hay una evolución, y eso lo menciona el profesor. Hay varios puntos claves que menciona el profesor basándose en Hannah Arendt. En principio, el derecho a tener derechos, una idea, y después el derecho a tener esos derechos y cómo esos derechos y por qué esos derechos hay que garantizarlos. Aquí la característica del ser humano hace que sea necesario establecer claramente la aplicación de los derechos humanos. Pero hay un punto en donde definitivamente la discusión teórica no llega, y me parece que es el caso también de la exposición del profesor. Él también, tomando de Hannah Arendt, utiliza una expresión fabulosa que se llama Heart of Darkness. Eso sería bueno también inclusive para una canción, Heart of Darkness. Que esta expresión de Heart of Darkness la está tomando también de Hannah Arendt. ¿Qué significa eso? Menciona simplemente que son situaciones que se han hecho en el mundo occidental, en los países de colonialismo, cosas de violación de derechos humanos que no se producen dentro de los países de origen del colonizador. Este concepto de Heart of Darkness es bastante interesante. Yo creo que uno de los grandes problemas precisamente de la migración es no pararse en estos aspectos, en los aspectos de carácter social y en los aspectos precisamente de una interrelación del mundo, que se habla por una parte de globalización, él habla de neocolonialismo y de otros fenómenos que están precisamente en Heart of Darkness. Si pensamos en la situación actual, aparte quizás de las complicidades de los gobiernos, si pensamos en la situación actual de la migración intensa por parte de África del Norte hacia Europa, si nos paramos en el fenómeno y vemos cuáles son las raíces, veremos que no son raíces en donde los países occidentales estén libres de culpa. Allí es una zona fundamentalmente de petróleo, es una zona en donde el fin de la Guerra Fría mueve digamos, zonas de dominio y en donde los países dominantes también toman posiciones. ¿Cuál es el origen de las migraciones? Podemos encontrarlo ahí, como se ha visto, y es lo mismo en el caso de la frontera México-Estados Unidos. Por eso ponía entre comillas la cuestión de la complicidad muchas veces de estos gobiernos, ¿no? En el caso mexicano, por ejemplo, este concepto y que tiene que ver también con los derechos humanos, la aplicación, el enforcement, la aplicación clara de los derechos civiles por una parte, pero los derechos sociales como que están en un limbo. La cuestión de derechos que son de carácter programáticos. Y eso también lo menciona el profesor con esta idea de dentro de las fronteras, el reconocimiento de los derechos, pero hay una zona que él llama twilling, zona, es decir, una aspiracional, zona aspiracional de los derechos. Yo creo que indudablemente podemos dar muchas vueltas, muchas discusiones y encontrar la esencia de los derechos humanos, pero creo también que es necesario centrarse en esos aspectos fundamentales que mueven las migraciones. Definitivamente los mexicanos no van a Disneylandia. Hay fenómenos de carácter estructural que los mueven, o a lo mejor van a la frontera a algún lado a divertirse, y lo mismo en el caso de Europa por parte de África del Norte. En eso yo pienso que hay que centrarse. Otra cuestión es que los derechos humanos, y esa es una de las cuestiones que no se ha producido mucho en la academia. Los derechos humanos tienen también que enmarcar los tratados de libre comercio, las actividades de carácter económico que tienen los estados. Tanto los tratados de libre comercio, por ejemplo, se han hecho siempre al margen de toda cuestión de derechos humanos. Es tiempo también de empezar a mencionarlo y parar. In general, Professor, I think it's very interesting your points of view. But I think the key question of your paper is, what about the social human rights? What about we are reading all the time that the social human rights are programmatic. But this is the big issue. Why programmatic? They are also human rights. And also to link all these kind of troubles with the movements of politics in the world. Saying about what happened in Middle East, for example. Middle East is full of oil, we know very well, and is the focus of the dominance of the hegemonies. So I think the international human rights should focus on this kind of troubles. It's the same in Mexico. Mexico is more focused in trade law, for example, and forgetting the question of the human rights. The movement from the south to the north depends also the economic problems in the region in general. This is my point of view.
No, thank you both. Very, very interesting. I just, that little picture I put up there, I just wanted to, it just struck me. I was in a plane and I was reading the in-flight magazine and I pulled this out. I'll pass it around for you to look at because the picture is actually from that. And so I said, wow, this is really interesting, you know. What's this about? And it's you know, from a theory perspective, talks about human rights in a very, very, very informed way. And of course, what it's talking about is that if you're rich, you can buy citizenship in another country. And not only that, but you also turn into a European. You know, so you see the two people on the boat. They started out as sub-Saharan Africans. They got a lot of money, and then they got dual citizenship. They turned white, and they got a big yacht. But it's exactly the problem. I'll pass it around for you to look at because it's really interesting. Because this is a company, and its business is selling citizenship. That's what it does. So if you're rich enough, you can buy it. And the people in the boats here, why are they different?
They do not have money.
Yeah, so one lot have money, and so they can buy citizenship, and the others can't. And what really makes me cross is when you hear people saying, these are only economic migrants. What's the problem? Why is it wrong for somebody to want a better life? Why do you think that's a problem? We had a referendum in Ireland, I think maybe around 2000, 2001. It was very interesting. The heads of the three biggest maternity hospitals in Dublin, our capital, went to the Minister for Health at the time and they said, we need more resources to deal with a very specific problem. The specific problem is that migrant women present very late in pregnancy. They have no medical records and so on and so forth. And they said, we want to help these people. We just need more nurses. We need a little bit more resources so that we can make them safe, that they can have their babies and they don't die and that there's no problem with their babies. And the government said, oh my God, we have a big problem. All these women are coming into Ireland so that their children will become citizens. Okay. And so this is a big problem and we need to solve the problem. The number of women we're talking about is probably 100. So we had a national referendum, and the national referendum was about changing the right of people born in Ireland to have Irish citizenship. So we said we have to get rid of this rule because it's a huge problem. Maybe 100 people a year could benefit from this. My God, how can we cope with this vast number of 100 people? You know, what really, I mean, a lot of Irish people were very cross about this because Irish people, like Mexicans, moved around the world to get better jobs. Something like 40 million people in the United States claim to be Irish. Almost half the population of Australia claim to be Irish. What were they? What were those people? They were just economic migrants. And then people in Ireland voted to change the law. They voted to change the law because they objected to economic migrants coming to Ireland. You know, this is a problem. How can you justify that? How can you say it's okay for Irish people to go around the world and get jobs, but it's not right for people to come to Ireland to get jobs? And we're absolutely right. The big problem here is economics. People are not going to America to, just for the climate, or they're going there to get jobs. No, of course people are going there for adventure, and what's wrong with that? But the big problem here is that we are sucking all the resources in the world out of the developing world. We're sucking them out of the developed world in order to give more and more and more and more resources to a tiny minority of extremely wealthy elites. So we organize the whole planet to make these people wealthier. And we call it neoliberalism. And we present it to people and saying, this is the only way we can have economic development. This is the only way we can do this. In 2008, the whole system collapsed. Ireland, the whole economy in Ireland collapsed in 2008. We are now lumbered with a national debt which is equivalent to the reparation payments made against Germany at the end of the First World War. The scale of the repayments that Germany was asked to repay at the end of this First World War in 1918 were so vast that they didn't finish paying them. This is Germany. This is, G7. This is the biggest economy in Europe. They didn't finish paying until this century. It took them almost 100 years to repay. We have that debt now in Ireland. The economy is thriving, but we have this debt. Why do we have that debt? We have that debt because the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, said the one thing that we can't allow to happen is that the banks will collapse and that the people who invested in the banks will lose their money. That's the most important thing. The whole system collapsed in 2008. And what do? We said, let's do it again. Let's do it again. Let's do more neoliberalism because it will work this time. And that's the problem we have. We are not standing back and we're not saying what is the problem in the world. We're just motoring along and we're like as if we're in some kind of a daze. And political leadership is really, really bad because political leaders aren't asking the questions. It's all the kind of issues that you raised in terms of our differential treatment of people and that we treat different people in different ways and so on and so forth. And we've come to a situation, and it's really clever in many ways, because I said to you at the very, very beginning, what is the thing that's always been advertised on the TV? They're trading on fear. They're telling you that you are in trouble unless you do the following things. You need this insurance, you need this, and this. So everybody is scared. So they say, well, maybe if we do look at economic rights, oh my God, what will happen to me and what will happen to my family? It's happening to you anyway. It's happening to all of us anyway. But we need to think a little bit more about where we're going in terms of next generation. What is the future? Is this the future? That people will get consistently poorer and poorer? That ordinary Mexicans will get poorer? That ordinary Irish people will get poorer? That we will build more and more walls to keep them out? Many, 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 many years ago, I remember somebody was telling a story. And the story was, there were these people living in a little village beside a river. One day, somebody's walking beside the river, and they notice a little crib with a baby in it, floating on the river. So they go into the water, they bring out the baby. There's huge excitement in the village. They said, where did this baby, we must save the baby, and so on and so forth. And they did, and they took care of the baby, and so on. The next day, 2 babies came floating down the river. And they went and they saved the babies. The following day was 4, then it was 8, then it was 16, 32, and then the numbers got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And what did they do? They created institutions to deal with these babies. They set up a whole apparatus around the saving of these babies. But nobody asked, where are the babies coming from? Nobody went up the river to see what was happening. And we're exactly the same. We're saying, oh my God, we are being flooded by migrants. They are overrunning our countries. We don't ask why. Why does somebody from sub-Saharan Africa, you can see the boats here, why would a young woman with a baby get into a boat that can't float with too many people in it, with a very, very high possibility of getting drowned? Why would you do that? You're not just doing that just because you fancy a trip to Europe. You're not getting up one morning and saying, wouldn't it be nice to go to Europe? Mm-hmm. You know? But we're not asking that question. The question we're asking is, have we enough boats out in the sea to monitor this? Have we enough restrictions? Have we enough containment camps for these people? We're asking the wrong question.
Thank you, Professor. Pues yo creo que damos pie a las preguntas. Yo, ya me había desanimado un poco. Estuvo muy interesante la historia. So, I have one issue with your paper that I would like to possibly discuss. And after that, we can open it up for discussion. And it seems to me that you're struggling with like 2 characteristics that differ in important ways. For example, we know that law's nature is parochial, right? It is parochial in character in the sense that we have jurisdictions, we have a specific context, and the laws, in principle, the day-to-day laws don't apply to everybody. For example, traffic laws here in Mexico City, they're very parochial, very have to do with a specific context and jurisdiction. They don't even apply to the state of Mexico or Morelos or nearby states, right? So you have that issue with the parochial character of law. And I think in the paper you're struggling with this issue of the parochial character of law and the universal character of morality, right? So, and that's where I see where you're trying to establish like an important and sound argument regarding why law does not have to be this parochial, and has to be more like morality in the sense of a universal nature. And the characteristic of morality, for me at least, it has this nature of being inescapable, right? Moral laws are inescapable. So, like two points regarding this issue is, one of them is I still need to see an argument that builds this bridge between the parochial character of law and the universal character of moralities. So that's one of my questions regarding your paper, more than the presentation of your paper, is what would this argument be like? And then in the end of the presentation, you presented this idea of global ethics, right? Apple's idea of global ethics. And the same issue, I still have the same issue, because when you mention these 4 characteristics of this notion of global ethics, it has to be free from natural or contextual constraints, right? Not tied to cultural worldviews, and it's procedural discussion and debate. So these characteristics, again, go against the nature of the parochial character of law. So that's like my uneasiness with the paper, and where I'm trying, maybe I missed it, but where I'm trying to get an argument here. And the second point is this: going to not to the legal domain, but to the moral domain, just the global ethics bit. So, I'm not trying to build this bridge, but for example, the first characteristic of this notion of global ethics, it says it's anti-foundationalist ethics. We don't have a pre-existing moral framework. Right? This is an important starting point for this. So the second question is, just in this moral domain, is I see you rely heavily on the idea of recognition and dignity and respect. So my question is the notion or concept of recognition part of these pre-existing moral frameworks for just the idea of the global ethics notion to have a plausibility, right? So I wanted to draw these 2 points for the paper. And that's what I have to say about the paper. But I don't know if you wanted to address this, or we open it up for discussion and then general comments. Or?
I can make some quick comments, I suppose. Well, the first one, I suppose, about the national rules or maybe even local rules. I mean, I suppose the point is that in Mexico, it isn't the case that I can drive on the left and you can drive on the right. We all have to drive on the right-hand side. In Ireland, you all have to drive on the left. They're not incompatible with global ethics, because obviously you need to decide things in Mexico, how you want things to operate in Mexico, and it's okay for people in Mexico to make the rules for Mexican society, of course. But you can't have a scenario, I suppose, one of the things that, an example, let's take this example. In certain parts of the world, female genital mutilation is part of the culture. Okay. So somebody says to you, well, this is how we do things here. And you say, well, hang on a second. Is that okay? Is it okay for you to do that? Is that all right? But say, well, it's part of our culture, it's part of what we do. You have to argue against that and say, it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable because it is not acceptable to visit violence on a baby girl or a young woman without their consent, or say it is actually wrong to do this anyway. But why is it wrong? And I would say it's wrong because at a fundamental level, that person has the same rights to autonomy and dignity as everybody else in the world. So they have it isn't right to mutilate their body. So there are some things you can say, but you can drive on the left or the right hand side of the road. That's not a problem. But there are some, as you say, some moral values that we need to discuss and debate and say, well, is this okay? Is it okay to treat people like that? And that's, I suppose, what we're talking about, the idea of what Jürgen Habermas would talk about, the force of the better argument. That if we have a political system that's trying to develop rights, it should be about argumentation, it should be about discussion and so on and so forth. And at a global level, that's what Apple is trying to achieve. Is sort of saying, okay, there should be some kind of discussion at a global level about these fundamental values. Where I'm coming from in terms of the idea of respect and recognition is that and it's the point that Arendt is making as well, that, you know, comes from our very humanity. And I suppose what really strikes me about the idea of recognition is that, and the idea of disrespect, is that it can actually give everybody a sense of why human rights are important. And it can give a starting point for discussion and debate. So we say there's no foundational ones, but at least we can start from there and say, well, there is at least one thing that we can all agree on, is that we are all human beings. And at least we can all agree that it's wrong to disrespect each other, or at least we should all agree on that. Of course, a lot of people don't, but they have to be able to justify why they think it's okay. And if they can't justify this in a rational, argumentative way, well, then there's a problem here. You say, it's not enough to say, God says so.
Yeah, the idea of the I don't want to monopolize here. The idea of the traffic example is that I understand the issue that beneath that there's this notion of just coordinating activities, right? Drive on the left, drive on the right, it doesn't really matter, but it matters to come to a conclusion so we can coordinate activity in society, right? But what I was trying to get at is that many of the arguments regarding these issues of the local aspect of human rights, or for example, the U.S. trying to argue for security, etc., instead of this respect for us as equals and human beings, have to do with this idea of the law being parochial, that they can decide what is better for them inside their borders, right? So that's what I was trying to get at, is that not only traffic laws examples, but even if you take it to the point of human rights, the idea of this nature or the parochial aspect of law has its consequences for this discussion of human rights. And they can seem as not good arguments, but we still have to come to this discussion with them.
No, I think maybe I'm misinterpreting, but I think the problem actually, and I mentioned it in one of my first slides, is this idea of political rights. So we have the idea of political rights that Mexicans make rules for Mexico. And in fact, that's exactly what we say. We say in this political community, then the people who make the decisions are the people living in the community. But of course, we know that there are people living in Mexico who aren't Mexicans. Do they have any say in this? And if Mexico, for instance, decides to build a chain of nuclear power stations just south of Donald Trump's wall, has that any implications for the people at the other side of the wall? And of course it has. So we can make rules, but we have to be cognizant of the consequences of those rules, and we have to respect the right of other people as well. But I agree with you, there is a problem here in terms of how we understand political communities. That is a problem.
Bueno, entonces podemos abrirlo a discusión del público. No sé si quieran presentar las preguntas en inglés o en español. De todos modos, si son en español, nos va a hacer el favor de traducirlas.
The first one, there's two similar.
Aquí viene, así se las paso todas.
There's two similar. There's two similar questions. The first one is, what do you think is the main challenge for Mexican society in human rights? That's the first one. And second one is, how can we harmonize the law and rights to get a better society? And this is the third one that is kind of implicated with those two. What's your opinion about the political immigration that the U.S. has implemented without respecting some of the human rights?
Espera, pero como un poco de orden aquí, porque también hay gente en el público que quiere hacer preguntas. Pero, bueno, está ahí incluida. Ah, ok, entonces.
Y el piso de abajo también.
Or you better like wanted to read the question and you choose where you...
Oh, no, no, it's fine. I'll answer whatever questions.
But slowly...
Probable él los puede leer.
Sí.
Okay. On Sunday night, I was walking back to my hotel. And just outside my hotel, there was a mother with 2 daughters. And she was organizing them to sleep for the night on the street. There are homeless people in Ireland as well, sleeping on the street. That's the challenge. Why is this woman sleeping on the street with her daughters? What human rights does she have? What human rights does her child have? And to me, that's the big challenge we all have right across the globe is, and a colleague here referred to it as this idea of social rights, where we've put them off the agenda and we've said, oh, they're not important. They're actually the most absolutely fundamentally important. There's no point in having rights unless you can live a decent life in your society. So that woman with her 2 children has the same rights as every other Mexican. I'm not sure if she's Mexican or not, but I presume maybe she is. So I think to me that's the big challenge. How we do it is an even bigger challenge because we have been sucked into, I would say, a very dangerous cocktail in terms of politics where defending national territory and national right has become really important and is really articulated very strongly by a lot of politicians. And we are also completely sucked into the idea of the neoliberal agenda. And this is it's a crazy way of seeing the world. It's only about me. In my university, I'm on the library committee. The librarian at the last meeting said, we are, from next year, from the start of the new academic year, there will be no fines on students for bringing the books back late. So I said, why? Why did you come to this conclusion? She came to this conclusion because the students internalize the idea of a fine as rent. Okay, so when they come back, they say, I'm paying the fine. The librarian says, but that's not the point. 6 other students wanted that book and they couldn't get it. But I'm paying the fine. I'm renting the book. I'm paying for it. That's all okay. That's a big problem. When we start thinking of the world in those terms, it's a big problem. But it's not the students' fault. They are listening to that from politicians all the time. It's about you. Greed is good. Margaret Thatcher came up with the term, greed is good. Once you start building a society on the concept that greed is good, then you're going to have problems. And to me, that is the big challenge. I hope now I've answered that question, but what was the second one? Was the second one the same?
Oh, no,
I've forgotten.
Okay. The second one was, how can we harmonize the laws and rights to get a better society?
Well, I think maybe, yeah.
And then, okay, this is twice. No, this is the third one. What's your opinion about the political migration that U.S. implement without respecting some of the human rights?
Well, you know the answer to that question. I presume, I don't think it's very good. Look, I mean, it's easy to point a finger at the United States, but all the countries are culpable in this. All the countries, including Mexico. I'm sure Mexico is at its southern border and is looking at the people coming up to its southern border and saying, where the hell are you coming from? What are you coming to Mexico for? We've enough problems on our own. And Ireland is the same. Exactly the same. Don't come with your problems here. Stay in your own country. We don't want you. So, United States happens to be at the end of the chain, from somebody who's come all the way from maybe South America, Central America, or whatever, but we're all the same. We're all culpable in this project.
Okay. To every right of a person, there is a duty of other. How does that apply to the human rights to immigration? Who is the enforced right? Who is the one who enforced that right?
Yeah, I think one of the problems we have in terms of human rights, I think, is that we, and there's a reason for it really, a political reason for it really. I think after the atrocities of the Nazis, we got a little bit scared about what the meaning of rights was really, and we stopped talking about obligations so much. And every right implies an obligation, so it's not just an entitlement, but we very often see rights as entitlements. That's the way we've been trained to think about them, as entitlements. But they're also obligations. It's the same in this scenario. We have obligations, and that one of the papers that you gave me was about that very issue. We actually have obligations, and this is actually quite scary because you listen to Donald Trump. He has no sense that there's obligations, none at all. He doesn't know anything about the Geneva Convention. If you said to him about the Geneva Conventions, he would think it was a meeting of people someplace. He'd say, oh, maybe it's the motor trade meeting in Geneva. He doesn't actually realize that the United States has obligations. And he's telling that to his own people. Half of them think there's no obligations either. That's a huge problem. We have a huge problem because people don't realize that we have obligations. And, so this really is a critical issue, but I think actually it's a political issue. International law has gone so far, but if people dismiss it or think they have no obligations under international law, what can we do? Why is his best friend in Moscow? We know how he respects human rights, and so it's a problem.
In this case, how do you think is it possible to talk more about the, for example, new economic order than the new moral or ethic, or universal ethic, which is a little bit very difficult to enforce? But we, internationally, international lawyers, could be better to start to work to create a new structure of economic order. What do you think?
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think if we stopped now at making new laws and new conventions, we would still have a lot of the job done. But unless we have some kind of economic basis in terms of social rights and what I would call factual rights, then we can't go anywhere. And I do think that legal theorists can hide in the law, and they can hide in, what the law says and what the law doesn't say. And I'm not a lawyer myself, and I find myself a little bit frustrated by this very often because, yes, we know that at some kind of formal level, rights exist. But if we know also that, in fact, in everyday life, they have no meaning for people because they can't do anything about it. If you're in that little boat in the middle of the Mediterranean and you're drowning, it doesn't matter very much what your rights are. And I do think this is the big challenge. We do need to start talking about the economic order. Absolutely.
Actually, there's a question for you, para usted, Dr. Becerra, and for you also, Professor Tuama. what can we expect of social economy equality in terms of scholarship and public policy? She, Susana Dávalos, asked this as a part of the success of the Trump over Clinton was the focus on social inequality rather than gender equality and freedom.
Well, look, I think there are mixed messages, to be honest. There are some very, 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 very positive developments, and I don't want to be pessimistic. I think it's important for us to be optimistic. Bernie Sanders was there. He had a campaign. Suppose he had beaten Hillary Clinton, maybe he wouldn't get elected president. But just for a moment, think, if Bernie Sanders had been the Democratic candidate, what kind of a different presidential election you'd have had? You'd have an awful lot of different kind of debate and discussion going on in America than we had. Because basically, to me, of course I wanted Hillary Clinton to win, but Hillary Clinton really was not about a different economic order. She was about maintaining the status quo, really. And that was the problem. And she never saw that that was a problem. In the UK, they had an election because the Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, wanted a stronger hand in negotiating Brexit. But of course, what happened was the very opposite. And there was a kind of a Bernie Sanders there, and he didn't win the election, but he certainly caused a problem because he won more seats and he created a scenario where the Conservatives don't have a majority anymore. In France, you had an election recently. Now, I wouldn't say we've got, the shining light of sort of the new dawn or anything like that. But what was interesting was Macron was elected, and he was elected on ideas around more social equality in Europe and about the European Union giving more emphasis to the social and economic issues in Europe and less on sort of maintaining the status quo. And the other thing was that his campaign was about solidarity in Europe. So it was about solidarity between the different countries. And he said an interesting thing. He said, the European Union is not a supermarket. So he said, to the countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, who are, really getting involved in this ultra-nationalist view of the world, he's saying, you just can't pick the bits that you like. There's a common project here. Common project is around equality. It's around the right of people to freely move and work in any part of the European Union that they want to do that in, and so on and so forth. And these are the reasons why the UK is in the process of leaving. They don't want that. But it's important, I suppose, that we begin to look at the solidarity, that we look at reciprocity. And I can tell you that people in Ireland in 2008, when the whole thing collapsed, and we looked at our European neighbours, and all our European neighbours were saying, oh, pay your debts now. Pay up now. They didn't. Any one of them didn't say, we are the ones who went, I want to use the analogy of horse racing. You understand about horse racing? So you go to the race course and you see a horse and you say, oh, I'm going to put 1,000 pesos on this horse. The horse comes second. You go to the bookie and you say to the bookie, I made a mistake there. I shouldn't really have bet on that horse. What will the bookie say to you? You say, oh, here's your money back. No. And this is exactly what happened in Ireland's case. The people betted and they got their money back. So there was no solidarity. So at least from that point of view, Macron is starting to raise the issues around, there needs to be solidarity. We need to look at the bigger issues. So there are some hopeful signs. It's not all negativity. But it is a big challenge.
Professor, unfortunately, we have to end up the talk. But if you are willing to answer the question, if we send it to your email.
I'll try.
All right.
We're optimistic. Por favor, si me ayudan a dar un aplauso al profesor Otuama. Y también a nuestros replicantes, a Elisa Ortega y al doctor Manuel Becerra, por su... Gracias a todos, gracias Julia de nuevo. Y ahorita, un mensaje de la doctora Julia Flores.
No, entre los aplausos hay uno que son muy merecidos. A Ingrid Franco y a Pati Díaz, quienes se encargaron de organizar todo esto. Fue difícil porque apenas ayer regresamos de vacaciones en la UNAM. Por favor, Ingrid, tradúcele al doctor Otuama. Tenemos más de 140 personas. Las otras se puso una televisión para transmitir en el presidente. Entonces, los invitamos a seguir participando con nosotros en actividades que vamos a hacer alrededor de distintos aspectos sobre la frontera, bajo la dirección del doctor Vega.
Bueno. Esas cosas, como dice prácticamente Ingrid, y o sea, si no fuera por ellas, no hubiéramos llegado aquí. Esa es la verdad, entonces yo tengo un papel muy mínimo que jugar. Muchas gracias de nuevo y estamos pendientes por otra de las actividades que se organizan. Gracias.